So now that the application is finished and all the features are integrated, it's time for some final polishing. For example, there's one mistake I made. In the chat screen Dart file, super init state should go to the beginning of that function, to the beginning of that method, I should say. It's not super bad. As you saw, everything works, but it is a better practice to call this first. So make sure to put super init state at the beginning in every init state method you might have. That's the first thing. Now, in addition, here on the chat screen, it's hard to see here, but you might see it in your local app. There is a little gray bar at the bottom of this drop-down button here. Now, if I go to the chat screen, there I have this drop-down button. There is an underline option, an underline argument which we can set, and you might think that this takes a number to define the width of the line at the bottom, but actually it wants a widget that will be rendered as an underline. And you see that by default that's a 0.0 width bottom border with in the end grayish color. Now even though it has this width, it seems like we're seeing it here. So let's try setting this to an empty container. If I now save this, this is entirely gone. So now we don't have this ugly border anymore. So that's another fix that makes sense here. Now if we do log out, we also got some issues or some potential improvements here on this login or sign up form. So let's go to that auth form here. The form generally works, but these text fields could be configured a bit differently. For example, on the email field here, I'm not too happy with how it behaves with a real keyboard. To be precise, I want to turn off autocorrection here. I always find this annoying on email addresses when it tries to fix what you entered. I also want to control the text capitalization, which means how it tries to turn certain characters to uppercase characters. And there I want to set this to text capitalization none, which means it's not going to capitalize anything. And with enable suggestions false, I'll also turn off any suggestions here, because I also find this annoying on email addresses. Now on the username here, that's a bit different. There I want autocorrection. I want capitalization on a word level, so that words are capitalized, let's say. And I still don't want suggestions though. And of course you can pick different settings, but these are the settings I'm going to choose. Now for the password, everything seemed to work correctly for me, so I won't change anything there. Now with that, let me log in real quick here. And also work on that message field down there, because by default, this will only produce lowercase words. So I'll go to that chat screen, no, to the new message widget I mean, and there we have that text field. And on that text field, I'll set text capitalization to text capitalization, let's say, sentences. I'll turn on autocorrections. And I will also turn on the suggestions, so enable suggestions set to true. And with that, if that rebuilds and I reload this app, if I tap into this again, you see now it starts with a capital character, and then I can type, and only if I end a sentence, it starts with a new capital character. So that looks better to me as well. And then there is one last thing, which is hard to see. If you restart the app entirely, so if I kill this here, and I restart the app, we briefly see the login screen before we are forwarded to the chat screen. And the reason for that simply is that the Firebase authentication package needs a couple of milliseconds to find out whether we have a valid token or not. So of course that's also not ideal, and therefore I'll add a new screen. I'll add a splash screen, which is essentially a loading screen I want to show whilst the authentication package is figuring out what's going on. So that can be a simple stateless widget, which I'll name splash screen, and where we need to import material.dart. And here I simply want to render a scaffold so that we have a nice background and so on, where as a body, I simply have some centered text, let's say. So simply some centered text where we say loading. And of course, you could also show a loading spinner instead, or do whatever you want. You can show whatever you want here. And now the idea is that we can show this splash screen instead of the chat or off screen if we don't know yet if the user is authenticated. So we can simply go to main Dart, and here, before we check whether we have data, we can check on our user snapshot if the connection state is equal to connection state waiting, which means we're still figuring out whether the user is authenticated or not. And if it is waiting, we just return the splash screen here. And of course, for that, you need to import the splash screen into that main Dart file. So now with that, I'm going to rerun this application and kill it first. And now when it launches this application here, we hopefully now see the splash screen instead of the flickering off screen. So let's see what we get here. And that looks better to me. There was the loading text for a fraction of a second before we were forwarded here. Now I think another tiny improvement is that on the splash screen, on this scaffold, we maybe also set the background color to our main theme color, to our primary color, so that we have like this pinkish background color there as well. So if I now kill this and rebuild and rerun this here, we should now see that this splash screen actually has this pinkish background color. Now that will not be our main application startup launch screen. I show how to configure that in the deployment section. This really is just the in-app screen, which is shown whilst we are waiting for the Firebase auth package to figure out if the user is authenticated or not. So that's something different. Yeah, and you can fine-tune this however you want, but I would say with that, we got all those improvements in place that really make this a great app with a lot of nice features.